Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of Catholicism in the United States. This is the fourth installment in the unit on colonialism and slavery. Picking up where we left off last time, in the year 1608, in the Spanish colonial sphere in North America, the Spanish established Santa Fe as a base for a colonization effort in encompassing the area that is now the states of New Mexico and Arizona. Missionaries accompanied this enterprise, but evangelization was stymied by the abuses of the Encomienda System, which was in effect the imposition of serfdom on the Anasazi people, or as the Spanish called them at the time, the Pueblos. Typically, what would happen is that the friars, the Franciscans in this case, would open a mission and obtain royal approval to have control over a certain area. This area would become economically prosperous through sheep herding, corn growing, trade of woven rugs, baskets, for which the Anasazi were well known. Once a prosperous enterprise was in operation, local encomenderos, having little fear of the government in Spain because it was so far away, and they could always buy support or, advocates or lobbyists, as we would say, they would concoct some legal reason for them to steal, to steal the church's land and take over the mission for themselves, and then just run it like an encomienda, just essentially a slave operation. The most convenient excuse they used was that the legal protection offered to the indigenous people by a mission, church mission, was no longer necessary because of the conversions, because they worked. So, okay, the Franciscans came here, they got this charter, these privileges, in order to convert the Indians. Well, then they did, so they don't need those protections anymore. So it could be considered a regular part of the empire, and in which case the encomenderos, should be in charge. So just another excuse to steal church property. In the following year, back in the French sphere in Canada, 1609, Samuel Champlain explored the 125-mile-long lake, which bears his name today, Lake Champlain, with a Huron guide. The Huron were members of the larger Algonquin tribal alliance. Near Ticonderoga, the group came upon an Iroquois settlement. Hostilities commenced immediately, as the Iroquois assumed that the French were Huron allies, and that those two tribal alliances had long-standing antipathy for each other, because the French had a Huron guide, so they saw a Huron and they said, okay, they're with the enemy. Champlain and the French were armed with guns, so they easily achieved victory and killed 2 of the 5 Iroquois chiefs. The Iroquois never forgot this encounter. They never forgot that the French were allies of their ancestral enemies, or that they had killed 2 of their chiefs. 3 decades later, the French Jesuits would pay the price for Champlain's actions. This also meant that at any time the French came into conflict with the British colonies on the Atlantic coast, that the British could rely on the Iroquois as allies against the French, usually for reconnaissance, information, supply, but also for combat operations, like commando troops. And so the French and Indian War, nothing just happened. So in American history, the French and Indian War, which is just over a century after this, there was still, that the French had the Huron allies and the British had the Iroquois allies. Initially, the French and the Huron alliance benefited both sides, with the French having access to furs, and in exchange, the Iroquois got access to European metal, axes, metal axes, tools, weapons, and more malignantly, brandy, French brandy. French Jesuits had great success among the Hurons, both in learning the indigenous languages as well as in teaching them French. Now, this was not an attempt to make the tribes French, as the Spanish attempted to Europeanize the tribes in their sphere. Because in the French sphere, the concept of becoming French by merely learning the French language, that's something that would have never occurred to a French person of the period. Gestation within a French female is the only way that one becomes French. There is no other way. In the long run, so in other words, that the French they weren't really there, to change. Initially, they were not there to make the area like France. It was just a commercial venture. They just wanted to trade and to make money. In the long run, though, this alliance doomed the Hurons, as smallpox reduced their population by 2/3, which enabled them to be overcome and virtually exterminated by the Iroquois, as we'll discuss in due course. The next year, to the south of Canada, in 1609, Henry Hudson was an English mariner, but employed by the Dutch East India Company to locate the Northwest Passage, the fabled Northwest Passage, through the Americas, to get to Asia. Like America was just like in the way. They just wanted to get through, just establish, resupply colonies, try to trade in something to make some money. But the ultimate objective was to get to India for the spices, get to China for the silk, and then bring that back to Europe. 4 years later, he followed Verrazano's charts. He explored what is now the Hudson River. He also mapped out Manhattan Island, all the way north to the present site of Albany. He didn't establish Albany, or Manhattan for that, but he mapped it out. 4 years later, in 1613, English colonists from Virginia attacked and destroyed a French settlement at Port Royal, Nova Scotia. This turned out to be a skirmish in what would develop into a multi-generational territorial dispute between the French and the English, the consequences of which would be suffered most by Acadian Catholics in eastern Canada. So, let's see. So here's Nova Scotia. This whole eastern Canada was Acadia. So here's Nova Scotia. Now Virginia. Well, Virginia's off the. Virginia's is down here, and then going up. Here's the St. Lawrence River. So Nova Scotia would be over here off the map. And why did the English do it? Well, it's just to steal, basically, just to steal. They wanted Nova Scotia for themselves. 6 years later, the English colonists from Virginia who attacked the French colonists in Nova Scotia made history again. In 1619, the first African slaves arrived in Virginia. That is the first of the 13 colonies, what eventually became 13 English colonies, to receive African slaves. The Sapelo Island off of Georgia, Georgia eventually became one of those colonies, but at the time it was in the Spanish sphere. So that this was not only in an area that would become one of the 13 colonies, but by the ancestors of English colonists who made the 13 colonies the United States. The economy of Virginia was constructed on the foundation of large-scale planting of tobacco. England, like Spain and Portugal, turned to importing African slaves to work these plantations because their efforts at enslaving the indigenous people of the Americas ended in their widespread extermination from European disease, to which they had no natural immunity. 1 year later, northward up the Atlantic coast, on December 11th, 1620, the Plymouth colony was founded by separatist pilgrims in 1620, and that's the Mayflower. And the Massachusetts Bay colony was founded by English Puritans in 1628. They were incorporated into a single colony in 1691. They were both, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, were both radical versions of Calvinism, holding that the established Church of England, the Anglican Church, had betrayed the Protestant movement by not fully purging all traces of popery. And popery is Catholicism. As a result of this antipathy, the anti-priest law of 1647 in the Massachusetts colony mandated banishment of a priest who was captured for the first offense. If the priest returned after being banished once, then captured a second time, the second offense was execution. So meaningful Catholic life had to wait until independence. Massachusetts would become the 6th of the United States on February 6th, 1788. So this is, all right, so you see, this is Massachusetts up here. So Plymouth, the map isn't detailed enough to have the distinction between Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but here's Massachusetts. You see its relationship to Maine, to Canada, up here, and then down New York, and then Virginia, Maryland. This is the Chesapeake Bay here. Chesapeake is Baltimore at one end, Baltimore, Maryland, and then Norfolk, Virginia at the opposite end. So orient yourself. Oh, and Washington, D.C., I suppose I should point that out. Yeah, Washington, D.C. Well, of course, it wasn't there yet, but this is where it's in. It was territory was taken from Maryland and Virginia for Washington, D.C. Orient your geography there. Okay. Massachusetts, these Calvinists, Massachusetts Calvinists, proved to be as violently intolerant of other beliefs as the Anglicans of Virginia had. Yet a noteworthy topographical difference between Massachusetts and Virginia would have long-term cultural and political implications for the way the culture of the United States developed, north and south. So topography, as well as religion, made a difference in this way. The topography of New England, where Massachusetts was, I just showed you, that topography, owing to the soil and the weather, the extreme winters, was not conducive to plantations, to large-scale production of cash crops, the way that the climate further south, like in Virginia, was. So the economy of Massachusetts and New England, as it expanded, initially centered on fishing and trade. This required skilled labor to construct, repair, and design ever more efficient ships, and then to process the result of the fishing, like whale oil. That was a whole subset of the economy. Yet, just how do you take the whale, go from a whale in the ocean to lighting somebody's lamp? Well, then that's a whole process that requires skilled labor, production. So that's how the economy, and then of course designing ships. That's engineering, that's skilled craftsmanship. To pick the right kind of wood, to shape the wood, They developed the oakum, to seal between the planks of wood. That would be rope. Well, first to make the rope. So they make the rope, then they'd hammer it between the planks, then pour tar on it. That would be like the insulation to keep the planks together. Sails, making the sails, designing the ships, building the ships. To put the keel in the right place, the rudder. I mean, all this is skilled craftsmanship. A completely different skill set than was required to do a tobacco plantation in Virginia. And that's all based on topography. So you could not have a tobacco plantation in Massachusetts, even if you wanted one, because the soil and the climate wasn't conducive to it. Whereas in Virginia, because the soil was richer and the water and the climate was more friendly, agriculture was the obvious thing to do. So then there was no need for them to develop, an economy built on whale oil, or fishing and on production. And so they developed different. So and then culture develops differently. If the center of the economy are giant farms, giant plantations, then the culture around that, the social interactions, are going to develop differently. Church life is going to develop differently. If you have people who are just always there, as opposed to Massachusetts, where it's a maritime economy, and like the men might be gone for months, weeks or months, before they come back. So then that's all the residential patterns. All that is very different, and it did have long-term effects, and those effects would move, from east to west, so that the culture of the New England culture influenced the way the culture developed in the north, and then the plantation culture in Maryland, Virginia, Georgia, Carolinas, as that moved from east to west, that influenced the development of what we think of as the American South, the way those two different cultures developed, based both on religious differences. Anglican, which still had some, papist elements, as they would say, had a hierarchy, had an idea of a parish structure for religion, as opposed to the Calvinist in the north, which were just congregational. Each congregation was independent. Yeah. Okay. 1622, January 6th. Pope Gregory XV created a new congregation of the Papal Curia, the Propaganda Fidei, the propagation of the faith. Their goal was to plant the gospel in previously pagan lands. This meant baptizing the native peoples of these discovered lands, then recruiting their sons and daughters for priesthood and religious life, send them back to their own people as priests and religious, so that the faith becomes part of their cultural life, and then wait so the church will develop based on this cycle for generations until it's ready. Then that culture will in turn send out missionaries of their own to do it again. So that's how the faith would be propagated throughout the world. Same year, 1622, on August 10th, John Mason and Sir Ferdinand George were granted a charter by the Council for New England for land between the Merrimack and the Kennebec rivers. Significant, because this is the origin of New Hampshire. New Hampshire would become the 9th state on June 21st, 1788, while Maine would become the 23rd state on March 15th, 1820. So Maine, was not one of the original 13 colonies. It was part of the colony of Massachusetts, but it was not a separate colony. That came later. And the reason we'll see is that Massachusetts, the people of Massachusetts considered it part of their colony, but the French in Canada, on the other, did not. They considered it part of Acadia. And so the Cajuns are going to get caught in the middle of this dispute over that, as one of the many disputes between the English and the French in the colonies, and the Acadians, the ancestors of the Cajuns, are going to be caught in the middle. 2 years later, 1624, the Dutch, following the charts that they paid Henry Hudson to make, the Dutch settled on what they called New Amsterdam, and that's Manhattan Island, New York, on the Hudson River. Well, it's in the Hudson River. They purchased the island in a trade with the Lenape Indians for 60 guilders worth of goods. So guilder was the Dutch gold coin, so 60 gold pieces. The Dutch remained for 40 years in this colony. New York was originally a Dutch colony until the English took it away from them in 1664. And then the English renamed it New York in honor of the Duke of York. New York would become the 11th state on July 26, 1788. 2 years later, 1626, 40 settlers, led by Roger Conant, settled in Salem, Massachusetts, where they set up a trading post. This was distinct from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was the Dorchester Company, so it's just another company that got a royal charter to do this. And Salem, Massachusetts, of course, the witch trials. Same year, 1626, the Company of New France was incorporated by the government. So instead of doing, as the English were doing, a separate company for each of these colonies, the French had it more centralized. They created a company for all of it, and New France was Canada. That's just what they were calling Canada. 1633, 5 years later, the Dutch West India Company established a settlement on the Delaware River. Chronologically, this brings us to Maryland. Catholicism came to Maryland in the following year, 1632. The Charter of Maryland is dated June 20th of that year. The background. Sir George Calvert, Calvert, the first Baron Baltimore, was born in 1580, baptized in the Church of England, Anglican, as part of the gentry, meaning landowning person. But initially, when he was born, he was not titled. He was not Lord Baltimore when he was born. The family was from Yorkshire in the north of England. George made an extended tour of Europe between 1601 and 1603, during the course of which he met and befriended Sir Robert Cecil, 1st Earl of Salisbury and spymaster for Queen Elizabeth I. Calvert named his eldest son Cecil, Cecilius, named in honor of Robert Cecil. During this trip, Calvert acquired a network of contacts, because of his friendship with Robert Cecil, as well as George he discovered, he didn't even realize it until he applied himself, but he turned out to have a facility at learning languages. This served him well during his period as a member of the Anglican elite. Robert Cecil routinely employed George Calvert on diplomatic missions, most noteworthy in maneuvering James VI, the King of Scotland, to follow the childless Queen Elizabeth I to the throne of England in 1603. And in that capacity, he took the title James I of England, but remained distinct as King James VI of Scotland. The following year, in November of 1604, George Calvert married a lady named Anne Maine, M-A-Y-N-E. They married in a Church of England ceremony, Anglican ceremony, in St. Peter's in Middlesex, England. With Anne, together, they had, with her, he had 10 children. He himself eventually had 13, but with her he had 10 children, including his eldest son, Cecil, and his second son, Leonard, both of whom figured prominently in the history of Catholic Maryland and therefore the history of Catholicism in the United States. and remained in the Church of England all of her life. George, though he eventually became Catholic, he did not convert to Catholicism while she lived. He converted 3 years after her death. King James rewarded Robert Cecil with the positions of Privy Councillor, Secretary of State, Earl of Salisbury, and Lord High Treasurer. Robert Cecil continued to use Calvert, and Calvert used Cecil. I mean, you know, that's the world. In August of 1605, George was given an honorary Master of Arts degree from Trinity College, Oxford, from the hands of the king. In the same ceremony, the Duke of Lennox, the Earl of Oxford, the Earl of Northumberland, and Robert Cecil himself all received the same honors. All of them got honorary master's degrees from Oxford in the same ceremony from the king. So, like, he had arrived, basically. George Calvert had arrived. On the next year, 1605, November 5th, the gunpowder plot occurred. All right, you know, remember the 5th of November? The gunpowder treason and plot. Yeah. All right, later Stuart monarchs. James I was a Stuart. This is a new dynasty. So it changed from the Tudor. Queen Elizabeth was a Tudor. She died childless. James came, and he's a Stuart. So a new dynasty. Later Stuart monarchs would show sympathy for Catholics, and 2 of them later became Catholic, Charles II and James II. However, when this new Stuart King of England, James I, showed no indication of moderating the anti-popery laws that existed in England, a group of desperate Anglo-Catholics, English Catholics, attempted a regime change from within, or a coup d'etat. In order to achieve this, the plan was to wipe out the existing government in one stroke. The result was the gunpowder plot. They recruited a Yorkshire convert to Catholicism who had some military experience fighting for Spain and the Netherlands. This guy's name was Guy Fawkes. The organizer of the conspiracy was named Robert Catesby. He rented a cellar, a basement, which was partly, the basement was partly extended underground under the House of Parliament. So he had it filled with barrels of gunpowder. You know, fill the basement with barrels of gunpowder. Guy Fawkes was the trigger man. He was to ignite the barrels when the king and Parliament were in full session, while the other conspirators would lead a military uprising in the countryside, march into London in the chaos, and then install a government. The plot was betrayed inadvertently when one of the people in the know, Francis Tresham, warned his cousin, who was Lord Monteagle. He didn't tell him about the plot. He just said, don't go. Don't go to Parliament on November 5th. So Lord Monteagle was suspicious. He advised, he talked to other people, said, well, what is, you know, and they said, well, what? So they started searching. And in the course of the investigation, they caught Guy Fawkes in the cellar with the barrels of gunpowder, waiting for his chance to ignite them. He was captured. He was put to the horrific torture. Since this is a family-friendly channel, I'm not even going to describe what was done to him. And of course, you know, he revealed the names, everybody's name. Some of them had already taken up arms. Others were killed in battle, just fought to the death rather than be captured. And that was the fate of the man who purchased the cellar. Others, Fawkes and the others who were captured, were executed on January 31st, 1606. The day of the foiled plot, November 5th, became known as Guy Fawkes Day in English practice. It was an occasion for public expression of rabid anti-Catholicism, a practice which was brought to the United States and continued until George Washington forbade it during the American Revolution, because, you know, they needed Catholics to fight for them. You know, oh, okay, all of a sudden Catholic, you know, they're okay. The following year, George Calvert was appointed Clerk of the Crown and Assizes in Connaught, in County Clare, Ireland. English colonization practice began in Ireland. You know, the way that they colonized so much of the world, that actually began in Ireland. And that set the template. And from there, it was imposed on a substantial portion of the globe. These colonization practices included, first, subtracting the target population from the protections of Magna Carta. In this case, the target population was the Irish Catholics. And the Magna Carta was, of course, 1215. That was the initial outlining a Charter of Liberties and Protections, what we would think of as a Bill of Rights. And, of course, it was modified so it wasn't, the significant thing was not so much the list in 1215, but the concept that a list of rights for people who were not, for everybody, you know, a list of rights could become law. You know, could be something that the government, that even the king, had to recognize. And that was a triumph. I mean, to give him due credit, but that was a genuine triumph in that concept in the development of government. Well, in colonization, you don't want the target population to have rights, because just by the fact that you're colonizing, that's theft. You know, so you're stealing from them, and that's a right. You know, they have a right to not be stolen from, and they have a right to due process as a redress of grievance. Well, then you can't give them those rights if you want to steal from them, especially if you want to steal their country from them. So the first step in colonization is you subtract that population from those who are protected by the Magna Carta. The way they do this is another set of laws called the penal laws. So using one set of laws to subvert another set of laws. Initially, this included closing Catholic schools in Ireland without due process. I mean, so no redress for this grievance, just simply closing the Catholic schools. Second, specific identification of potential subversives in the target population. In 1607, Catholics were barred from holding public office in Ireland or obtaining officers' commissions in the Army or the Navy. Third step in the colonization strategy is deprivation of all legal recourse as individuals or as a group. In 1613, a land requirement was instituted for membership in the House of Commons, the Irish House of Commons. So that limited the option of even running for election to holders of large plantations. But because of elements 1 and 2 in the strategy, those were all either Anglicans or they were Irish Church of Ireland, which means Protestant, Irish Protestants, or allies of the English. Fourth, harassment and financial crippling of the target population. They must be impoverished. Catholics had to pay recusant fines, like that, not a tax, it's a fine, but you have to pay it. And this recusant fine, this is a fine for not attending Anglican services, because it's the national church. And they had to pay a fine for not serving in militia duty. All right? So, but the reason they couldn't serve in the militia was because of the 1607 law that prohibited them from doing so. So use the law against the law, so that, the rule of law, okay, it's a wonderful thing, and, on the whole, it's done more, I suppose, it's done more good than harm, but it has done harm. And this is how it's done. So if you have a superstitious reverence for the law, almost consider it as divine in itself, then you just realize it's just another construct. Human law is just another construct. So you have one set like the Magna Carta, and then if that's inconvenient, well, then you just create another set to undermine that. So, right. Fifth, masses had to be conducted privately, in secret. So that's exactly what the Muslims did. For those of you who are watching the series on medieval, that's what the Muslims did. That you had to practice your faith modestly, which means behind closed doors. So the Anglicans did that. The English did that to the Irish Catholics. Sixth, priests initially were not actively hunted, but if a local official wished to terrorize the local population of Irish Catholics with a captured priest, then those priests could be treated as de facto traitors. Because in 1570, the Pope at the time, Pius V, declared that the English monarch, Elizabeth, was illegitimate, and therefore the population was not obliged to obey her. And so if somebody wanted to say, okay, a Catholic priest, then, since the Pope has done this, then those in service of the Pope are traitors, de facto traitors, if they're English. If there were foreigners who came, foreign priests that came in, well, then they're spies. And because of this, there were 17 Catholic martyrs from this period, beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1992. And he added, subsequently, he added 3 beati that were beatified. And anyway, okay. Seventh, when such injustices as the previous 6 points in the strategy, some people are the whole purpose is to demoralize the target population into just accepting subservience. And some are just going to lose, they're just going to lose heart, they're going to give up and say, well, okay, then my life is just going to suck until I die. But not everybody's going to have that attitude. Some are going to be provoked and say, well, they don't have a right to do that. This isn't their country. I never wanted to be English. I'm Irish. I don't want to. And so some people are going to want to fight. And just drive them out. Well, inevitably, some people are going to make that decision. And when that happened, the thing is that colonizers are waiting for that to happen. Part of this strategy is provoking that, because not everybody in the population is going to have that attitude, but the ones who do are the ones that are a threat. So if you provoke them into going out in the open and fighting, that's your chance. You get them all together on the battlefield and exterminate them. And so that's how the English avail themselves of this opportunity. Specifically, the Adventurers Act, March 19th, 1642. This was a way of raising money to suppress the Irish Rebellion of 1641. Of course, the Irish didn't see it as a rebellion. They just said that we want our country back, so we'd leave, get out, but the English saw it as a rebellion. So the Adventurers Act invited members of the public to invest £200, for which they would receive 1,000 acres of land, not in England, in Ireland. So once the Irish rebel, so you invest in this enterprise, paying to put the rebellion down, then your reward is you get 1,000 acres of Irish land. And the Irish lose that land as punishment for rebelling. And they're rebelling because of the institutionalized injustices outlined in the first 6 steps of the colonization strategy. So you see that it's all. But this is how empires are built. Nice people do not build empires, because empires are based on theft and oppression. In this way, 2.5 million acres of Irish land were stolen, or as the English would say, set aside for this purpose. The entire island of Ireland is about 20 million acres. So of that, 2.5 million acres were stolen just by this one thing, this one Adventurers Act. In July of 1643, Parliament passed the Doubling Ordinance, which doubled the allocation of land to anyone who increased their original investment by 25%. So they could get 2,000 acres of land stolen from the Irish. The enactment was done at the request of King Charles in the House of Lords, later joined by Commons, and was unanimously accepted in Parliament without debate. Thusly, our empire's built. In terms of understanding the Anglo-American ecclesiology, as it instantiated in the Maryland colony, founded by the Calvert family, it is essential to appreciate that Calvert personally witnessed all but the seventh item of the penal laws, of that strategy, of the colonization strategy. It's all the penal laws. He personally witnessed the enforcement of all but the seventh of those on Irish Catholics in their own country when he was stationed in Ireland. Now, while later critics of Maryland Catholicism that Calvert and his descendants founded deplored the attitude that those Catholics had of hyper-patriotism, aversion to Catholic devotions, fawning and ingratiation with the Protestant elite of the United States. To be just, you cannot forget the context. Calvert experienced, and he knew firsthand, what happened when you resist. You know, when Catholics, we saw what happened when these Irish Catholics in their own country attempted to resist imposition of empire on them by the English. So he passed on to his sons and the Catholics that they recruited to come to the Maryland colony this way. You know, do not draw attention to yourself. Do not antagonize the Protestant elite. They outnumber us. They have more guns. They have the law on their side because they're the majority in the legislature. They're all, after this, they're all the ones in the legislature. They have an agenda, you know, so just pay your taxes, do what they tell you, just accept the injustices, and we'll practice our faith, you know, modestly, quietly, not drawing attention to ourselves. So there's reasons for everything. From the time of his appointment to Ireland in 1606, and for the next 19 years, George Calvert kept busy in royal service. His specialty was high-level diplomacy on the continent on the king's behalf. Because he had the language skills to do it himself, he did not have to rely on interpreters. Whenever you get an interpreter, then that's a potential leak, that's a potential spy, or even if the person is initially loyal, that's somebody who that could be bought, you know, and leak information. So there's advantages when somebody has the skill has enough language, not just to do simple greetings or talk over dinner, but to really do these kind of negotiations where laws are involved, legal concepts are involved. So that's true mastery of the language as well as mastery of the law. All right, sorry about that. That's the problem with doing this during the day. But now that I have to do 2 classes of videos concurrently, I can't just wait till, you know, nighttime to do it. Okay. His specialty was high-level diplomacy on the continent, including arranging marriage alliances, negotiating trade agreements, and even mediating peace treaties. The details of his activities in this period would take us too far afield because they weren't related to the church. But one factor must be identified as making the Maryland Project possible. And that is relevant to us because that's how Catholicism got into the Anglo-American milieu. During one of his missions to Spain, George met and came under the influence of an English Carmelite, which is a religious order, member of a religious order. His name was Simon Stock. named in honor of the more famous saint, Simon Stock, of that name, 13th century saint, the brown scapular devotion. Now, George remained officially Anglican for years after this, but this relationship planted seeds for his later conversion. In terms of his interest in colonization, which later made Maryland possible, George first invested in the Virginia Company in 1609. He invested in the East India Company in 1614. In 1617, George was knighted for his exemplary service in the diplomatic corps. In 1620, he purchased a tract of land in Newfoundland. I already showed you that on the map, off the eastern coast of Canada. Well, part of Canada. I mean, you know what I mean. But he purchased a 42,000 square mile. He purchased the tract of land on Newfoundland, which is a 42,000 square mile near Arctic island off the northeastern coast of Canada. He purchased it from Sir William Vaughan. Sir William Vaughan was a Welsh writer and colonial investor who had tried and failed to establish a colony. George took it off his hands. He bought it. And he named his new property Avalon, after the Arthurian legend. Avalon is that's where King Arthur was supposed to have been buried, but if he really, or he'll come back, as in the legends. Foolish are they who seek the grave of the once and future king. But after the Battle of Camland Field, his body is supposed to have been taken there to Avalon. So anyway, so George's plan was to develop Newfoundland as a fishing colony. George recruited Welsh colonists, mixed Catholic and Protestant, under Captain Edward Wyne, W-Y-N-N-E. They landed in Newfoundland in August of 1621. The first report, written in summer, praised the climate, the abundance of the fisheries, and the potential for commercialization of salt, hemp, flax, tar, iron, lumber, and hops. Of course, after the first winter, no one praised the weather again, but the other qualities remained as justification for continuance of the project. So prosperous did his Newfoundland colony become that the colonists were subject to harassment from French merchants, privateers, and pirates who resented English presence in the region, which they regarded as French. Keep this in mind. As the hostilities continued into multiple full-scale wars, and as I keep teasing, one of which resulted in the Acadian Catholics settling in Louisiana. Meanwhile, George hired an English privateer, to provide naval protection for the Newfoundland colony, and in January of 1623, he obtained royal title to all of Newfoundland under his personal rule. So that was another construct in English law. It was a proprietary colony, as opposed to a royal colony, which was considered the personal property of the king that he bestowed as a fiduciary onto someone, or a parliamentary colony, which would be the same thing. And it's usually the way Parliament would do it is they would charter a company. So it was like a public-private partnership for the colonies. But a proprietary was like this. It was just the king was chartering it as the personal property of an individual, and it would be in his family, descend in his family, rather than a corporation. And that was in January of 1623. George did not, so he makes the law in the proprietary colony. He did not yet issue a charter of religious liberty, so that idea did not emerge yet, but he's going to do it in the Maryland colony. But functionally, George provided Catholic priests as well as Protestant ministers for both sets of colonists. In the course of his public duties as a royal diplomat, George finalized negotiations for a marriage alliance through the betrothal of the French princess Henrietta Maria, for whom Maryland is named, would be named, marriage of her to the Prince of Wales, who would be the future king, Charles I. This Charles did become king when James I died on March 27, 1625. At that point, in 1625, George Calvert made known to the king, the new king, that he was Catholic, that he converted to Catholicism. That was huge. That required him to surrender all of his offices in the government and the income that went with it. Yet Charles was grateful for George's loyal service. So Charles created for him, to replace that income, created for him a peerage in Ireland, a royal title in Ireland, the Barony of Baltimore. It was in County Longford, Ireland. So that's how George is the first Baron Baltimore. Free now of government duties, George sailed for his now 6-year-old Newfoundland colony. He hadn't even been there yet. I mean, he was managing this through employees. He landed on July 23rd, 1627. He brought with him more settlers, both Catholic and Protestant. To serve the Catholics, he provided the services of 2 Catholic priests, Father Thomas Longville and Father Anthony Pole. For the Protestants, he provided an Anglican minister, the Reverend Erasmus Stourton. Pleased with the progress made, George returned to England for more recruits, and in 1628 returned with his second wife, Jane, several of his children, and 40 additional colonists. Added to the soul-crushing winters, George had 2 ongoing problems. First, he had to use 2 private ships, meaning his own property. He just bought these ships, the Ark and the Dove, to fend off French attacks on his fishing fleet. Second problem, the Protestant colonists were hostile to the Catholic Mass being said in the colony. Even though they had their own minister, their own minister, they had their own services, but they didn't want the Catholics to have, their Mass. Because that's popish, you see. And then, in the first matter, George had mixed success. The French did manage to sink or capture some of his fishing vessels, yet with the Ark and the Dove armed, George managed to capture some of the French ships. So it was, kind of give and take. He sold those French ships back in England for a profit. But yet he still had to pay to have more fishing ships built. So, this is kind of a, In the second matter, with the Protestant colonists, George was betrayed by his own trust. The Anglican minister, Erasmus Stourton, knew before accepting the position that the Newfoundland colony was going to have Catholics, and it was going to have Catholic priests, and those priests were going to say the Catholic Mass. So he knew that, yet he accepted, and he was continuing to accept his payment. Yet, once in the colony, he started objecting to it, and he wrote those objections back home to England, that George allowed both Anglican and Catholic services to take place in the same place. So they were both taking place in George's home. Not at the same time, but just in the same place. Whereas this guy, the Reverend Stourton, wanted the Catholics and their priestcraft relegated to outdoors. Just let them do that under a tree where nobody can see them. In a tribute to his diplomatic skill over the previous decades, George still had enough friends in the upper echelons to cover for him, even after his conversion to Catholicism. George, at the pleading of his second wife and some of the children who joined him in Newfoundland, begged for a warmer home. He was still a stockholder in the Virginia Company since 1609. So he took steps to secure a private holding, to build a house, in other words, in its undeveloped regions. So this is another step toward the Maryland colony. In October of 1629, George arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, where the hostility of the Anglican Virginia colonists was so pronounced that he returned to England to obtain a charter that they could not obstruct. The following year, 1630, his second wife drowned when her ship that was bringing her from Newfoundland to Virginia foundered in a storm, and she died. Nevertheless, he persisted in seeking a charter for lands in the Virginia Company. He was opposed by other stockholders, Protestants, in particular William Claiborne, but they had not yet developed the Chesapeake Bay, so they weren't making money, and so that they weren't, and without making money, then that limits the taxes, to go back to the crown. So they didn't have much standing. They had not impressed, the government. Whereas George had a history of making a profit from colonial ventures because Newfoundland was doing very well. So he succeeded in persuading the king to grant him a charter of land north of the Potomac River on both sides of the Chesapeake Bay. George died on April 15th, 1632, at the age of 52. Did all of that, and he's 52. Before the final seals were put on the charter. The date that was sealed and dated June 20th, 1632. So it was left to his son, Cecil, to bring Maryland into being and to pay 20% of all the produce, 20% of all the gold, 20% of all the silver to the crown for the privilege of this charter, along with the symbolic presentation of 2 Indian arrows each winter had to be sent to Windsor Castle, which means somebody from the company had to go there personally and present it, so that the king wasn't happy he'd arrest. So that's what all this was staged. So this is all right. Okay, so here is the Chesapeake Bay. They have Virginia and the Maryland colony. Right here, Maryland and Virginia. So Chesapeake Bay, as I said, at the northern part is Baltimore, the south is Norfolk, and so they got both sides. So the eastern shore, Maryland, that's still part of Maryland. The Chesapeake is beautiful, and very abundant fishing and crabbing. I guess crabs aren't really fish, but it's seafood. So he did have the potential, and then they, of course, they're going to do tobacco plantations. All right. 1633, the Dutch West India Company, still in competition with the English, established a colony in what would become the state of Connecticut. The second Baron Baltimore, George's son, Cecilius Calvert, Cecil Calvert, or Cecil as we'd say in the United States, was prudent and astute, and he never forgot the lessons his father taught him about the horrendous treatment of Irish Catholics in their own country by English Protestant colonizers. Realizing that Catholics would always be a numerical minority, subordinate to a Protestant government, his instructions set the tone for Maryland Catholicism, for Anglo-American, English-American Catholicism. First, begin with an oath of allegiance to the crown, in this case, King Charles I. Second, Catholics should practice quietly, indoors, without calling attention to themselves. Third, Focus on converting the Indians to Catholicism. Do not attempt to convert the Protestants, because then that would draw attention, hostility, and therefore legal action. And as he's seen, the law was no protection for Catholics, because the law would just be, they'd just make another law, just make a different law to undermine the laws that was supposed to protect. Fourth, use only Church of England colonists, Anglicans as colonists, as ambassadors or emissaries when dealing with other English colonies. So that was Cecil's strategy, to protect Catholic colonists from what happened to the Irish in their own country. In part, his instructions read, quote, that he's referring to the governor and the commissioners of the Maryland colony, that they cause all acts of Roman Catholic religion to be done as privately as may be, and that they instruct all the Roman Catholics to be silent upon all occasions of discourse concerning matters of religion, and that said governor and commissioners treat the Protestants with as much mildness and favor as justice will permit. Very careful, very prudent, recognition of reality. Necessity exists. Cecil Calvert was the eldest son and heir. And from him, from George, he inherited the title Lord Baltimore, the Maryland colony, and the Avalon colony, which is Newfoundland. Since he did not have the advantage of his father, who spent decades in royal service, cultivated friendships with those in power, Cecil had to remain personally, for the most part, in England to defend his business interest. He did, however, have the advantage of having been baptized in the Church of England and having graduated from Trinity College, Oxford, in 1621, all of which happened before his father converted to Catholicism in 1625. Cecil delayed his own official conversion, or at least admitting it publicly, as he was licensed as a barrister, a lawyer, on August 8, 1633. That required taking the oath of supremacy, recognizing the monarch as the head of the church. Having lived in the Avalon colony on Newfoundland for 5 years, Cecil continued the religious toleration practiced by his father. So Maryland became a haven for Catholics, as well as other religious dissenters like Quakers. He maintained Maryland in this way for 42 years, until his own death on November 30th, 1675, at the age of 70. Paradoxically, considering the effort and money he invested, Cecil never visited Maryland personally. He retained the title of Lord Proprietor and Lord Baltimore, but appointed his younger brother Leonard Calvert as governor. Leonard's labor on site made Maryland a reality, made it a going concern, a profitable venture, just as much as Cecil's legal protection and financial support back in England. Cecil continued this practice of governing through deputies. The sixth and last was his only son, Charles Calvert, who inherited upon Cecil's death in 1675. It was Charles's misfortune to see all of it ruined by the Glorious Revolution, as it's called in English history, in 1688, because Parliament used that as an excuse to steal his family's property, ending the Catholic-friendly colony until after the American Revolution. In 1634, turning to the Spanish sphere of North America, Alonso de Benavides, Alonso de Benavides, recorded a description of the missions, the Catholic missions in New Mexico, what would become New Mexico, dated February 12, 1634. By way of background, in 1595, the asiento, or the royal patent, for the conquest of New Mexico was awarded to Don is a title, but his name was Juan de Onate. So Don Juan de Onate. With the spiritual tasks were entrusted to the Franciscans. In 1630, the friar Alonso de Benavides, who was a spiritual descendant of that expedition, returned to Spain to report to the Franciscan general, who was Bernardino of Siena. In 1624, this friar revised the report for dispatch to the Pope, Urban VIII, to promote interest in the New Mexico mission and to urge the establishment of a diocese in New Mexico. His description was as follows. Each friar had to cover 4 to 6 pueblos, villages. 20 Indians live in the pueblo, in these pueblos, in these villages. Porters, cooks, gardeners, bell ringers, They prayed in common, and they served the sacraments when the friars made their rounds. In every pueblo where a friar resided, there was a school to teach prayer, singing, musical instruments. They prayed the divine office in common. A bell was rung for prime. They did that in choir. And after that, it's morning prayer. Then after that, they would clean everything. A bell rang again. Then everybody would go to their particular jobs for 90 minutes. Then they would have Mass. After Mass, they all knelt and sang the Salve Regina in their own language. Meals were served, eaten in community, and the friars would then go and travel to the different pueblos. They're on a circuit, and a bell would be rang in the evening for Vespers, evening prayer, which they would also do in community. For the support of the poor, the friar had the residents raise grain and cattle, some of which they ate, some they traded, other they would stockpile and give to the poor. Yeah, all right. So, and it's just basically an early mission parish in the Americas. The Jesuit mission in the English sphere of North America was inaugurated by 3 of their number in March of 1634, when they established a mission in Maryland. Father Andrew White, Father John Altham, and Brother Thomas Gervais. Their first headquarters was in St. Mary's City, Maryland. Their spiritual heirs endured, the Jesuits, English Jesuits, endured into the early national period and gave the new nation, the new United States, its first bishop, John Carroll. He was a Jesuit originally. The society was suppressed at that point, and I think I have that in the notes. See, this is the problem. See, a lot of this with the Protestant movement in the early modern period was covered in the 3rd-year course, so the seminarians have had it, but those of you just watching the channel, sorry. The Society of Jesus was suppressed between 1773 and 1815. Just leave that as a short answer. But within that, in 1789, John Carroll was made bishop, the first bishop of Baltimore, first bishop in the United States. He had originally been a Jesuit. After the society was suppressed, he continued being a priest, just not a Jesuit. So this record I'm about to cover is an excerpt from a letter written by Father Andrew White to the General of the Order. And it was dated, signed from St. Mary's City, April 1634. It recorded that they set sail aboard Calvert's ships, the Ark and the Dove. The family still owned them. They sailed from Cowes on the Isle of Wight on November 22nd, 1633. During the last week of December 1633, 12 members of the expedition died of a fever, including 2 of the Catholics, Nicholas Fairfax and James Barefoot. On March 25th, 1634, they celebrated Mass on an island in the Chesapeake Bay, which they named St. Clement's Island. They cut down a great tree, and from it they made a cross. They continued sailing about 27 miles from St. Clement's Island to the mouth of the Potomac River, which empties into the Chesapeake. They entered the river to continue their journey. They noticed natural harbors at the river's mouth, which Father White estimated could hold 300 of the largest vessels of the day. They named one side St. George, the other they named after the Blessed Virgin Mary. They debarked on the riverbank in the territory of a chief, an Indian chief, Iroquois. He willingly sold them a tract of 30 miles of land on the right bank of the river, which was depopulated at the moment because he was losing a conflict against the Susquehanna. From the chief's perspective, these Anglo-colonists would serve as a buffer between his enemies, the Susquehanna, and his remaining territory on the left bank of the river. A mile from the shore, the colonists laid out the plan for a city, St. Mary's City. 3 years later, to the north, in French Catholic North America, a Norman French Jesuit, who began his missionary career in 1625 at the age of 32, was Father Jean de Brebeuf. He was a Jesuit. He suffered hideous torture by the Indians who captured him. He survived and returned. He was captured and then tortured to death by the Iroquois in 1649, who raided the missions of St. Ignatius and St. Louis near the Georgian Bay. Brebeuf wrote an instruction in 1637 to guide younger Jesuits who who were going to be sent to the missions. Brebeuf was canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1930, along with 7 other Jesuit martyrs of North America. 3 of them met their deaths in the diocese, in what became the Diocese of Albany, New York. The others were in Canada. So one representative sentence, have sincere affection for the savages. Again, sorry, that's just the word they used. Looking upon them as ransomed by the blood of the Son of God. To conciliate the savages, you must be careful, never to make them wait for you in embarking. Further, there's an excerpt from the next year, 1638, from the annual letter, which was sent unsigned by one of the Jesuits in Maryland back to the Jesuit headquarters in Rome. In it, we learn that there were 3 Jesuit priests in Maryland in 1638, Father Andrew White, Father John Altham, whom we've met, and then a new one, Father Thomas Copley. A 4th priest joined them, Father John Knowles, Knowles, but he lasted only 2 months before dying, quote, of the common sickness prevailing in the colony, whatever that was. There was a brother also on the original voyage, Brother Thomas Gervais. He was already dead. We learned that in this letter. That, quote, he chanced to be seized by the disease prevailing at the time, and happily exchanged this wretched life for an immortal one. The Jesuits had to secure their own land for profitable production to support themselves as well as their mission. They had to fulfill their spiritual obligations to the Catholics of the colony. They had to fulfill their missionary mandate to evangelize the Indians, the indigenous people, all while avoiding antagonizing the Protestant majority. They also had problems dealing with the indentured servant system, which even some Catholic colonists abused. Officially, servitude in the indentured servant system was 7 years in exchange for someone paying your passage to the New World, after which you'd be free, to go do what you want, to set up your own, your own stake in the colony. But sin exists, greed, cruelty, injustice, all exist. Some of the holders of the indenture, meaning some of the people who paid for the transport, sought to prolong it by at the end, oh well, no, your 7 years isn't up because you owe me room and board for those 7 years, and clothes I may have bought. Some days you may have been sick and didn't work, so you owe me for all of that. So they tried to prolong it, in some cases for years more, and they added interest for any such payments. Like when the 7 years were up, if the person couldn't pay for all of whatever imaginary fee that they calculated that to be, well then they started charging interest. So even if you did, to try to prolong it for as long as they could, with the goal of prolonging it until they could no longer work, and then you throw them away. Then they're no longer indentured, and you just replace them with somebody else. Yet, the Jesuits, and so there were some Catholics who were doing this to rich Catholics, who were doing this to poor Catholics, as well as Protestants doing it to Catholics. Yet the Jesuits were, to an extent, dependent on the goodwill of these same holders of indenture, because those are the ones with money who could support the mission. So it would end when the agreement. One solution to this problem was that the Jesuits would simply purchase the indenture of somebody who was being abused this way. Like they would pay off the indenture. And so theoretically the indentured person would then be indentured to them. But the Jesuits would free them from it. So that was like we covered in the last session. Like the Mercedarians and the Trinitarians would go to Muslim slave markets and simply buy Christians who were being sold and then take them back home and free them. So this is the same kind of idea, but for indentured servants. This report in 1638 mentions that 2 such Catholics were freed in this way from indenture to Virginia colonists. Catholics who were indentured to Protestants in Virginia. The Jesuits bought their indenture to save them from this. The necessity for these Jesuits to obtain and manage their own property figured prominently in later history. It led to their implication in the slave plantation enterprise of the South, yet it also enabled the creation of Georgetown University. All right, we'll stop there. Next, we're going to continue with other Jesuits, and we'll meet St. Metairie, and we'll see what happened with the Stuarts in England, only because it's going to affect the church in the United States, or in the colonies that became the United States. So we'll pause there for the moment. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.